Welcome back. Well, with the future of Kosovo driving a wedge between Russia and the West, what course will things now take? As we've already heard, a UN initiative's already stalled. Russia wants continued talks between Serbian and Kosovan leaders without granting the province independent status. But the US has apparently given the contact group of 6 nations a 4-month deadline to win a consensus for independence. Or it seems willing to take Kosovo back in going it alone. So how would that play out? We're still joined by our guests in Washington, Nicholas Vostev, editor of The National Interest and senior fellow of the Strategic Studies at the Nixon Center, and in Moscow, Dmitry Suslov, deputy director of research at the Council for Foreign and Defense Policy. Mr. Vostev, setting a deadline for the 6-nation group, is that a wise thing?
It's a gamble. The Bush administration is hoping that this will galvanize the contact group into reaching some sort of consensus by saying that this is not going to be an open-ended process. The risk, of course, and I think as Mr. Suslov has pointed out, is that increasingly an attitude in Moscow, and one could also point to it in Beijing and elsewhere, is not simply to accept a ultimatum handed down by the United States as a take it or leave it process. And I think that they're very willing at the end of the day to say, fine, we haven't reached consensus and we're not going to go ahead with your plan on this. So if you want to recognize unilaterally, you take the consequences. The Bush administration does seem confident that there can be movement. I think that they've gotten a sense from Javier Solana that there is a possibility of a European initiative that could somehow bridge the difference between Moscow and Washington and come up with something that Serbia might be able then to accept, and then if so, Moscow would be in a position not to have to be more Serb than the Serbians on this issue. But it is a risk that will come into a deadline in November. We'll have no settlement. And then the U.S. is going to be in a very difficult position if it decides once again to take a unilateral step bypassing the United Nations.
Mr. Suslov, do you think it's an unfair bargain, this offer for Serbia? Either you forfeit Kosovo or you don't get EU membership?
I think it's a bad option because exactly you deteriorate the Serbs, you raise the nationalism in Serbia, and as Mr. Kostunica, if I'm not mistaken, pointed out, they will not change EU membership for Kosovo. So I think it's a bad blackmail, and we can't support it. This is not a way of improving institutions, of raising rule of law, and implementing other policies necessary for EU membership.
Mr. Suslov, one of the issues here is that Kosovo or Kosovans have already been promised that they will get independence soon by many big nations. Now, is that a big problem that if they don't get it very soon, they're going to be very angry? What sort of developments do you foresee with Kosovans after having been promised independence not getting it?
Well, that's the problem, actually, and the reason that problem emerged symbolizes and tells that the Kosovo Albanians are not controlled. They run the cause of their own, and they are not controlled neither by the UN, nor by NATO, nor by the United States. And this is one of the factors behind which Russia is saying that Kosovo will become a failed state if it's granting independence. I don't think it was a wise decision to promise independence. And I'm really skeptical about the results of the negotiations in the contact group. I think there won't be any positive results. And finally, Kosovo will proclaim its unilateral independence, and this unilateral independence will be recognized by the United States.
Just thinking of some of those ramifications if Kosovo don't get independence soon, I've got a quote from the Kosovo Liberation Army, head of War Veterans Organization. He said, "We will be obliged to act as KLA soldiers and to realize the last will of our nation's martyrs." Mr. Vostev, are those ominous signs?
They are ominous signs, and one of the problems that the United States faces is, frankly, it's bogged down in Iraq. It has no stomach for engaging in any vigorous nation building elsewhere. And I think that the threat of violence against any remaining U.S. and NATO forces in the province is a serious one. It then, of course, runs up against the question about negotiations, which is, are we having real negotiations leading to a settlement, or are we simply looking for a way for the United States to extricate itself from Kosovo and be able to proclaim success? And one of the problems that the administration, unfortunately, has backed itself into is that it now has this dilemma of how it's going to bring about independence for Kosovo, get the United States extracted from the region without damaging its relationship with Russia, as well as with several European countries. There's not unanimity in the EU about proceeding ahead with unilateral independence, a recognition of that should it take place. And so it could lead not only to a crisis with Russia, but to a real problem with our transatlantic relationship. And so I think that the hope, against hope, I have to say, is that Condoleezza Rice hopes that when she meets with the Serbian foreign minister to discuss this issue, is somehow they can get the Serbs to accept the inevitability of independence for Kosovo and get the United States off the hook. But the United States has no plan B for Kosovo.
But I'm sorry, let me interrupt you here. Kosovo's status is in limbo. How damaging is it, not only for Kosovo, but for the entire region, if their status continues to be in limbo?
Well, if it continues to be in limbo, you have, for example, the issue of what happens in West European countries. You have Kosovar Albanians who travel. If they're arrested, they're technically citizens of Serbia. Are they deported back to Serbia, or are they sent back to Kosovo? You have questions about who has rights over all of those mines and other industrial infrastructure, who has to pay the debt. And then just simply look at the map, look at the communication routes that run through Kosovo. If you continue to have unclear status, there's no way that you can develop the pipeline routes that are expected, the communication and transport routes. And then finally, there's the human equation, that the continued instability means that people don't know whether they're ethnic Serbs, ethnic Albanians, what the status is of their municipalities, of their rights, and so on. So that the longer that final status is left in limbo, there are problems. The question, and the U.S. is still, I think, has not grappled with this sufficiently, is in the end, you need a deal that everyone can sign on to. The U.S. thinks it can impose a deal on Serbia, which you can only impose it if you're actually willing to enforce it. And the mood here in Washington, if it's people who want to pull us out of Iraq by 2008, there's certainly no enthusiasm here for sending 20 or 30,000 U.S. soldiers back to Kosovo to try to enforce a final settlement there. So that's really, from Washington's perspective, the fact is that we want a final outcome, but we're not really in a position to do the heavy lifting that would be needed. Because in the end, let's face it, no matter what settlement you come up with, there are going to be people dissatisfied.
All right,
Serbs don't want
gentlemen, I'm going to have to stop
you
you there, Mr. Vostev. We've run out of time on the show. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Dmitry Suslov and Nicholas Vostev, both in Moscow and Washington, and a little bit earlier on, Vladimir Radomirovich in Belgrade. And thank you so much for joining us here for this edition of Inside Story. Bye-bye.